Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Carvalho, and I'm the Global Networks Manager with Health Technology Assessment International. We are very pleased to have a webinar today hosted by MSD. Before we get started, I did just want to remind everybody that this is a sponsored session, and there is some text on the screen that relates to the disclaimer, just to make sure you're all aware. So with that, I will hand it over to MSD and Lucia to kick us off.
Great, thank you, Chris. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Lucia Cordon. I am a director with Reuben Martin, and I will be facilitating the conversation today. So let's get started. We are, as you know, the pre-conference webinar is a preview of what will be coming as part of the Idea Factory session. And through the webinar, we'll provide a preview of the session, as well as some background on last year's session. So we would like to start by introducing you to the Ideas Factory concept for those of you who were not able to join us last year. And then we'll share outcomes from last year and introduce a challenge question that we will be tackling as a group on the 17th. We'll also provide a preview of the expert presentations that will be shared on the 17th, and introduce you to one of our guest speakers, Axel Mobacker, who is a health economist and healthcare management professor at the IGM Institute of Health Economics and Healthcare Management in Neubrandenburg, Germany. And then we'll take questions and answers, and then we'll do a recap of the session. So let's get started. For those of you that had the opportunity to join us last year, you probably remember we had pretty good representation across the US, Canada, Europe, Latin America, and Asia. And during the Idea Factory session, we asked all of you to think through a challenge statement which focused on the sustainability and health system readiness given the wave of oncology treatments that are in development. So as we know, just in the last year, more than 15 oncology medicines were launched. And so we asked the group to think about the impact of this wave of innovation that is coming. So in terms of the session format, we asked all of you to brainstorm in small groups and come up with as many ideas, recommendations, and solutions on specifically the following three topics. One, how do we address budget predictability and access? Two, how do we improve patient outcomes while having optimal clinical impact? And three, how do we ensure that patients and clinicians are front and center in the decision-making process? And then after this ideation component that went over a period of 35 minutes, over 130 ideas were generated through the discussion. They were inputted through an electronic computer system, and then those were prioritized by a technical facilitator and voted on by the group. And then we had a discussion around how to move these recommendations forward, and how some of these themes could lead to additional ideas for consideration. So some of the solutions that were developed, and I won't provide a full background on everything that came out of the discussion. You can actually find that report out on the HTAi website. But some of the things that came out was considering value frameworks that embed social determinants of health, and also the concept of removing funding silos to ensure that budget trade-off decisions are made collaboratively. And then as part of that discussion, that also raised the question of earlier versus later treatment and the value that we place on patient quality of life and avoidance of metastatic disease. So that was last year, and building on that discussion, and of course the success and the positive feedback that we received from participants around the Idea Factory, we've decided this year to follow a similar format, so similar group ideation that will specifically focus on evaluation considerations for early cancer treatment. As we discussed as a group last year, early treatment holds exciting promise for patients. At the same time, appropriate valuation and regulation requires consideration of early endpoints and quality of life benefits for patients. Some of these benefits that previously have not been available to patients, such as the avoidance of metastatic disease, of course. So, as a group, on the 17th, we will consider the question of what value do we place not only in survival, but also in sparing patients the experience of living through metastatic disease. And within that, what evidence do we need to give payers, policymakers, and patients confidence in this potential? So as a preview to this year's Idea Factory, what you will experience is a brainstorm and ideation of solutions to this specific challenge. Similar to last year, we will agree on a short list of solutions to be translated into recommendations. And we hope that the group will, of course, leave Cologne with new ideas, fresh thinking, and some recommendations to take home. And then in terms of providing upfront technical content and a baseline for the discussion, similar to last year, we will open with presentations from two experts. One of them will be Professor Michael Unsch from Helios Hospital in Berlin, and then, of course, Professor Axel Mobacher from the IGM Institute of Health Economics and Healthcare Management. So, Professor Unsch is the Chief Physician in Gynecology and Head of Interdisciplinary Breast Cancer at Helios. He specializes in preoperative systematic therapy for breast cancer, treatment of metastatic breast cancer, cancer surgery, chemotherapy, and he will be providing the background on the promise of early treatment from the clinical standpoint. Then we will hear from Professor Mobacher, whose research focuses on methodological advances in decision analysis, operations research, econometrics, and choice experiments, and then their application in the health domain. His work focuses on stated preference research, empirical research to understand the behavioral aspects of health, and problems of multi-criteria decision-making to inform the design of policies and regulatory decision-making. So today, we're fortunate to have Axel here with us to provide a preview of this baseline content that he will be sharing on the 17th, specifically as it relates to the valuation challenges of early treatment, challenges and opportunities of incorporating patient perspectives into value assessments. And with that, I will turn it over to Axel to provide a bit more information to the group. Axel will share a few slides over the next 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience.
Hi, this is Axel. Axel Mobacher. I'm from Germany. I'm a health economist, and I'm going to present some ideas about value assessment frameworks and how they might be applied to assess oncology treatments. And I first of all want to start off with some terms. And every time you open a newspaper or in the news or you get some health economics, most of the times people are talking about value. There's hardly a company who doesn't provide value to patient. There's hardly a payer who doesn't pay for value. And that paradigm shift might have started off with the book of Porter and Theisberg. And they defined value-based healthcare as a delivery model in which interventions are paid based on outcomes and their impact on patients. And that certainly led to the paradigm of money for value, which means we're aiming at rewarding services and products which for helping patients, for how much they improve health, how much they reduce effects or incidence of chronic diseases, or in an overall look how they actually have better lives. Which means value is derived from measuring all the favorable against the unfavorable effects of an intervention. That seems a little bit tricky because it's interesting how we do this, and if we actually have something like a value assessment frameworks. So the conclusion is if there's no value assessment framework we could trust, it probably would be hard to have something like a value-based healthcare system. So value assessment frameworks help payers, physicians, patients, and consumers to assess the value of medical tests, medicines, or other healthcare services. These frameworks should support decisions towards a market-based healthcare system that is both value-driven and patient-centered. Acknowledging that there's no single right approach to determining patient value and needs, we need some structure. We need to have some ideas how this can be done. And there has to be much work. There have to be various organizations who develop value assessment frameworks. So, for example, the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association, they developed the value assessment framework for cardiovascular care. American Society for Clinical Oncology, ASCO for cancer drugs, National Comprehensive Cancer Center, also for cancer drugs, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, Drug Abacus, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review also has a more generic framework, and the European Society for Medical Oncology, ESMO, does have a value assessment framework for cancer drugs or cancer treatment interventions. So we took a closer look on these value assessment frameworks, on how to see if there's a structure, if there's a common approach to come up with a metric explaining the value of alternatives. Because once you start comparing different alternatives, there has to be some sort of metric describing that value. And I just present here the two frameworks from ASCO and ESMO. And you can see that even within the same indication, even within the same disease class, these frameworks still have differences. So the purpose of the ASCO framework is the information about the clinical impact and financial affordability, whereby ESMO tries to explain benefits and risks, pretty much to help decision makers prioritizing outstanding new drugs. So you can see even the two origins of these frameworks had some impact. While the ASCO, based in the US, is looking at affordability, that's not the first goal of the ASCO framework. And I'm just looking at the darker blue areas. So the target stakeholders for ASCO are patients and physicians within a shared decision-making context, whereby ESMO is actually looking for payers, policymakers, and then clinicians. The way they define value is also a little bit different because ESMO doesn't have a clear definition, where ASCO looks at the elements of clinical benefits, toxicity, and symptoms validation derived from a clinical trial. So both have the basis of clinical trials, but the sheer definition of their understand by value is actually documented when you look at the key metrics, the components of value. And I'm starting now with the ESMO using absolute survival gains, disease-free survival, progression-free survival, and hazard ratios, whereby this can be translated what ASCO means by clinical benefits. Here they're stating overall survival, progression-free survival, response rate, and toxicity, but also ASCO is extending that framework towards bonus points, and these points are actually given for palliation of symptoms, treatment-free intervals, significant improvement in quality of life. So the ASCO framework could be seen as more open, including more effects which might not be addressed within clinical trials. I think that's interesting because the identification of decision criteria has a major impact on the results and the comparison of these drugs, technology, medical devices, or medical products. Going back to the table, the cost measures, ASCO looks at drug acquisition costs and out-of-pocket costs. And as you can tell, ESMO, more European, doesn't really specify it and leaves that open for payers. There's no direct involvement of patients out-of-pocket costs, which addresses the differences of these systems. The outcome, that's very interesting. The ASCO claims to have something like a net health benefit score, and the ESMO pretty much says there's a ranking of clinical significant benefits. So the benefit score should give us the chance of a cardinal ranking. A cardinal ranking means there's a scale with an overall benefit where the compared alternatives, treatment options, can be plotted on that single scale. And the difference where these alternatives are plotted does have a meaning. While if you have a ranking, the difference between first, second, third, fourth doesn't really have a meaning. That's within these the techniques of these scales. So ASCO actually should be able to have a cardinal scale, whereby ESMO it should be sufficient to have an ordinal scale. Sorry. The question is, how do they come up with these scores? How do they compose these net health benefit scores? And the ASCO does use a weighting scheme. They do weight the clinical effects, favorable or unfavorable, in order to come up with that benefit score. And the interesting thing about the interpretation is that ASCO, the American Association, sorry, is looking forward to have a tool where patients actually can weight these decision criteria in an online software tool. This would be a big step forward because that gives the decision makers, doctors, clinicians, the chance to incorporate something like patient preferences. That means the value judgments these decision makers make are not only based on their own judgments or preferences, they now could be based on patients' preferences. This is something the ESMO magnitude scale does not incorporate by now, but in the literature, these two organizations already agreed to align their two value assessment frameworks. So the questions arises, why do we actually have to operationalize? Why do we have a structure? Why does there has to be a theoretical background to these value assessment frameworks? And I want to give you a quick impression of why. And the main reason why is a problem. The problem which arises if you assess or appraise drugs, and here in the case of oncology, is that there are multiple decision criteria. There are multiple clinical endpoints which impact the decisions either of experts or patients on which alternative, which option is best. And I just have a quick look on these dimensions. And if we start on the right, on the upper right, it's the overall survival, probably the best measure, but a lot of things have to happen until overall survival or death can be measured. In between that, there's progression-free survival, remission, there's time to occurrence or reduction of symptoms, There might be a measure like disease-free survival, and there's health-related quality of life, which can be measured throughout the treatment process. But also, side effects, adverse events should be taken into account if different options are weighed against each other. And also, one might think of administration of a certain drug or technology, and there are things like time to treatment failure. So we have lots of criteria who actually help to assess the performance or the value of certain drugs. And in order to have a patient-centered healthcare system, we need and we have to rely on patients' preferences, patients' perspective on how they actually do prefer certain performances, certain effects within these endpoints. The last slides I just used to demonstrate that I think there can be a structure. I think there could be a generic approach to value assessment frameworks. And right now we're working on this generic structure, and we would like to transform or have a transition of the generic framework towards an indication-based framework here in oncology. And we use the background of multi-criteria decision analysis. So the decisions are complex because they involve trade-offs. I've shown several effect measures or metrics where patients, experts have to trade off between multiple, often conflicting objectives. MCDA and the literature behind MCDA provide a great framework to assess the value of health technologies. MCDA describes a set of techniques for evaluating decisions in healthcare, and it offers several different tools to elicit references from stakeholders. So all the instruments, methods, and theoretical background discussions which are needed to build a value assessment framework are within the literature and the discussions of multi-criteria decision making, which is backed up by decision theory and decision analysis. To give you at the end a short idea how these value assessment frameworks could look like, I just would like to address the questions which arise once you build one of these value assessment frameworks. First of all, you have to decide which endpoints, which quality criteria, which effect sizes or effect metrics, which decision criteria are being involved within the evaluation of different alternatives. So which indicators have to be considered? And that does have impact on the results, because if some of the decision criteria are left out, that might impact the overall score, the overall value of certain alternatives. I give you an example. If the mode of administration of certain drugs does have impact on how patients value certain treatments, we have to consider if a drug can be given with a tablet or with a shot, with an injection. Is this always being considered when talking about the value? I would doubt it. Next question who arises is, how do patients weight quality indicators? How do patients weight benefit indicators? It's hard to believe that all of the effects, favorable effects and unfavorable effects, are being weighted by patients the same or are equally weighted by the patients, not even by experts. So we have to know what is most important and what is least important, and how does that affect the decision making, the perceived value or benefit of certain treatment options. Third, how do patients perceive the value of different levels? I give you an example. If we have, sadly enough, you cannot see me, so I don't have very much hair left, and you're going to see that once we meet in Cologne. If we think about losing hair, it's not a linear. It does not relate with linearity to what people think of having a benefit from hair. So I personally can tell you, losing the first 10% of hair, that really impacted my benefit. It didn't impact my quality of life, but it certainly, I felt it. But losing the last 10% of hair, that was not that bad. I didn't actually feel it. So assuming there's linearity in hair loss would lead to a big misunderstanding on how patients would actually view the symptom or the side effect for any treatment option. That's what's meant by scoring. And we need evidence on how patients see that. Fourth, it's the analysis, the question on how to aggregate these different sources of evidence, clinical evidence, patient preference evidence, and how this is being aggregated towards a score which then is being plotted on a scale, which can be cardinal or ordinal. So behind that aggregation, there are a lot of mathematical and statistical assumptions and rules which have to be adhered, where a lot of things could go wrong. So that's a technique by itself. And last, the threshold, the interpretation of these scores. The question is, are costs not incorporated, or are these scores, these benefit scores, these health benefit scores, are they being compared to the monetary scales, which actually reflect prices and costs of certain treatment options? And how are they being compared? How does the threshold look? So for example, NICE uses a fixed threshold with the same willingness to pay throughout all of the disease classes and indications, whereby Germany doesn't actually have a willingness to pay. It doesn't have an overall willingness to pay in order to make a decision if something is accepted or not. It just looks for the best option, the most efficient options within each indication or disease class. And both of these solutions do have its pros and cons, and both can be justified based on the law, based on some sort of theory, but people just have to make these decisions and actually stick by it and be transparent. And then, we could come up with metrics who describe efficacy or effectiveness, metrics who are able to actually inform comparative effectiveness, and metrics who inform decisions which are focusing on efficiency. All of these three areas are different. They use different metrics. They have different mathematical and statistical assumptions, which should be clear throughout the process. And that at the end would actually lead towards a preference-based quality metrics or a preference-based benefit metrics or utility metrics. You see, I like to use the word quality metrics, and that's because you don't get as much in trouble as if you use the term. So just at the end, 3 statements. And these value assessment frameworks, or even MCDA, does not provide a right answer. And it also does not provide an objective analysis, because all of these decisions who have to be made throughout the aggregation process, throughout the identification, throughout the scoring, throughout the weighting, they're all objective. Researchers, they're all subjectives, because researchers are not always objective. And these frameworks do not provide or do not relieve decision makers of the responsibility of making difficult judgments. So we still need these expert panels, but we actually could help them. We could help them by incorporating meaningful data. And what I mean by that is we could incorporate patient preferences systematically and transparent. We even could incorporate experts' preferences or judgments, transparent, and not just by being interviewed and then the decision makers make their own decisions. There's another chance. We could align economic and clinical decision-making models. And what I mean by that is, in the clinical world, decisions are based on clinical trials. In the economic world, talking about reimbursement and pricing, throughout the world, we mainly discuss quality of life, QALYs. So why do we use a QALY system based on quality of life if we talk about money, and we use clinical effects based on trials when we talk about clinical decisions? So I rather would have a system where clinical decisions were based on clinical evidence also lead to efficient decisions, also could inform decisions about reimbursement and pricing, and don't go another route using QALYs or quality adjusted values. These frameworks and the use of patient references could inform value judgments. So stakeholders, experts could incorporate these patients' preferences within their decision-making context. And I don't think there is a single country in the world systematically transparent and a structured approach to incorporate this kind of evidence within their decisions. And only a framework which is structured, transparent, could be the source of the thinking that we actually pay money for value. And only if we pay money for value, then we could think and drive our healthcare systems towards a value-based healthcare system, like the promise Porter and Teisberg gave in their book, which I explained in the first slide. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you in Cologne.
Thank you, Axel. All right, so we are going to open it up now for Q&A. So feel free to start typing questions. You should be able to do it through the chat option on your screen. We'll be collecting questions and then sharing them with Axel. So I guess in the meantime, Axel, why don't we start with the most obvious question given the Idea Factory discussion. So from your perspective, given the importance of embedding patient input, what is the role that you think patients should be playing in inputting preferences into valuation of specifically adjuvant therapy?
Okay. I think value only can be defined if you have the information, the evidence about what patients want. If you have the perspective of the patients, that is the only way of documenting value of certain treatment alternatives. So every time there's a new treatment, every time there's an innovation, every time we talk about these incremental benefits, they should incorporate evidence about the weights, the perspective of patients. So what I mean by that and how this is actually, how that influences daily life. Well, if, for example, if we talk about acceptance of different treatment options, that certainly is driven by what people want, what they need, mainly their preferences. How could they be incorporated? We certainly have different levels. The micro level, if doctors talk to their patients, they sure have to ask them what they prefer, how they weigh certain side effects towards positive results or positive effects like longevity, etc. But also on a regulatory level, decision makers for assessment, for approval, pricing, or reimbursement should incorporate these informations, this evidence, in order to make transparent decisions about the value of certain options. And only then prices would reflect the advantages societies have or patients have by these products. And if we pay the right amount of money for innovations, that also has great steering effects. It steers healthcare system towards the most valuable options, and therefore the healthcare systems gain efficiency.
Okay, thank you, Axel. We have a follow-on question to that, and the question is, given the statement you just made, wouldn't that mean that for new drugs or technologies where there is no data, patient values would really reflect hope?
So the question is if we should use hope, or if the question is that we should provide data about hope.
I think the question is a response to your statement saying, are we really talking about hope then? And then is that basically the metric that we're using, or how do we develop a metric that reflects that?
Yeah. I personally think hope is one of the most discussed and one of the most dangerous metrics or indicators of value. And I would like to make this more precise or concrete. So, for example, the use of the endpoint progression-free survival could incorporate something like hope. The question then arises: are we really going to pay for hope? And I just see this as an ongoing discussion, but I could give you the example. If there's a certain cancer and progression-free survival does not impact or is not related, is not correlated with overall survival, the question is if a prolonged progression-free survival is valuable to patients and therefore should impact the discussion on reimbursement and prices. And we do have preference studies where we can see that if we prolong, if there's a longer disease-free survival, if there's a later progression, that is seen as valuable by the patients. The question is why and how? And even if we do not correlate this with overall survival, it is still valuable to patients, so it doesn't give them a longer lifetime, but it's still seen as valuable. And the question is this correlated? Is this impacted by hope? And that's where it ends. That's where we have to do further research. Hope is an indicator which should be paid for, which is for value to patients. I hope this was answering the question. If not, please come back.
So for the individual who posed that question, feel free, if you have a follow-on, feel free to type it. Otherwise, maybe I think this is a good segue to another question, since we're talking about patient preferences. So the question is around
say the name and the country and the institutions where these individuals come from who asked the questions.
We're not able to provide the information in terms of the institutions, but if the participants asking questions would like to include their institution, then feel free to type it up as well, and then we'll share it with Axel. So going back to the question, to the follow-on question in terms of patient preferences. So a follow-on question is the fact that patient preferences can be quite divergent. And so given this reality, how do you incorporate them? Do you ask as many patients as possible, or rather representative?
So incorporating patient preferences in regulatory decisions, there could be these two approaches: societal preferences or patients' preferences, or for patient populations. I'm in favor of using preferences from patient populations because these patients have experienced the need, have experienced the symptoms, they have experienced they may have experienced already some side effects from different treatment options, so we get a more informed data or evidence about these preferences. If it comes to decisions on an individual level, this can be interested on how to incorporate patient preferences within shared decision making. That means if incorporated, these patients have to be informed about the side effects or the favorable effects on how they would actually affect their life. So that's the question there. To sum this up, on individual level, I could think of surveys, instruments, which are given to patients once they reach a doctor, once they get in their doctor's office, the doctors are informed about their preferences. If it comes to regulatory decisions, we can have health preference studies. They have to stand for the patient populations, they have to be published, they have to adhere to certain guidelines, and then they can use within the regulatory process.
Thanks, Axel. So a follow-on question to that. This one is around the current level of meaningful inclusion of patient preferences and the fact that it is fairly spotty. And so the question is, current efforts rely on very few patient inputs that are not always accompanied by commitment to really inform and engage patients in the design of the criteria. What type of commitment, what type and level of commitment do you think is necessary to ensure that this is an ongoing process and is meaningful?
What is meant by commitment? So I get the question that this is referring to the validity of these studies or reliability, but I don't understand the commitment.
Well, I will allow the person to clarify, but our understanding is that the question is around commitment by valuation processes and by payers to take patient input in a meaningful way. So moving away from the spottiness, but really making sure that there is a commitment to making patient input a central part of the assessment.
Well, we just finished a study within the European Union where we looked at every regulatory decision maker of the member states, and we looked at EMA, and the question was how they use patient preferences. And the results were interesting. So there's certainly a few pilot studies, and these agencies are well aware that they're making trade-offs, and they're making these trade-offs for patient populations without having evidence on how these patients actually see these risks of adverse events, how they actually value certain promises of drugs. But the pilot project until now did not feed into a transparent use of these patient references. And I give you an example. In Germany, the GBA, which is the appraisal part of the evaluation, has certainly patients on board. They're called the third bank. They're allowed to discuss, but they're not allowed to vote. I cannot think of a reason why they should not be allowed to vote, because they're mainly representing the consumers of these innovations or drugs. So why are they not incorporated to the decision-making process? I can think of a reason why that might be tricky. That's because they do not have evidence. There's no systematic commitment to integrate evidence about patients' preferences. And the reason is there's no formal structure which actually is ready to incorporate these weights into a formal decision-making function. If you think at NICE, where they use the quality, if you look at the EQ5D, they certainly have the tariff, and the tariff is nothing else than the preferences for certain health states in order to come up with an aggregated score addressing the value of each of these health states. So within the countries who actually use evidence about health states and then aggregate these health states towards a unidimensional score, that is actually already preference-based. But that the critique would be they only use health states, quality of life. And if you think about EQ5D, that's based on 5 indicators. So if we want to make decisions about oncology drugs who are based on 5 generic indicators, that could be a dangerous move. I hope that I did answer the question about the commitment.
Thank you, Axel. And so I think just given time, we're probably going to start to wrap up. So let's end with one question from us to you. Given the diversity of perspectives that we're hoping will be around the room on the 17th, so based on last year's participation, we're expecting that there will be a number of patients represented, HTA, payers, industry, of course, policymakers, and some other groups. Given this diversity, what would you like to ask the group to think about?
Oh, yeah, I have the question I'm most interested in, if there is a variety of people in the room, is what keeps you away from using a structured approach and incorporate patient preferences? Because I think there's enough research done within the field of patient preferences to start thinking about using that kind of evidence. And there's also enough literature on these frameworks, not even within the value assessment frameworks, it's within the MCDA and the decision analysis, decision theory literature, that we actually could start tomorrow having better decision making on all levels, shared decision making, regulatory decision making towards approval, pricing, and reimbursement. So what's actually stopping us? Why do patient advocates do not use evidence about patient preferences? Why do regulatory agencies do not move towards a more structured decision making?
Thanks so much, Axel. We are at time, so we will close for today's pre-conference webinar.
Thank you, Lucia. So just on behalf of HTAi, I'd like to thank all of you for joining, and to Axel and Lucia and the MSD team for hosting this session. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.